The snow had already covered her tracks by the time she noticed the wall. Not a fallen tree, not a shadow. A wall, half buried in frost and dead grass, standing exactly where no wall should have been. Margaret Coyle had walked that slope a dozen times that winter, always with the same axe, always with the same silence, always counting how many pieces of deadwood she could carry before her arms gave out. She had never seen it before, or maybe she had, and her mind had simply refused to call it what it was. She brushed the snow away with one glove, slow, almost apologetic, as if the stone might change its mind and disappear. It did not disappear. 3 days earlier, she had counted what remained of her woodpile and said nothing out loud because there was no one left to say it to. Her husband had been gone since October. The wood he had cut for that winter would not reach February, and everyone in the valley knew it, though only Elias Whitfield had been honest enough to say so to her face. She had not come looking for shelter. She had come looking for something to burn. What she found instead raised a question she was not prepared to answer. Because the wall was not a ruin. Not really. Someone had built it with intention, angled it against something, protected it from something, long before Margaret Coyle had ever set foot on that ridge. And whoever they were, they had chosen this exact spot for a reason that the wind, even now, seemed to be explaining to her if she was patient enough to listen. She was not yet. It would take a failed fire, a cracked wall, and a storm still 3 weeks away before she understood what the wind had been trying to say all along. If you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where in the comments. Stories like Margaret's survive because people still take the time to remember them. And if frontier history like this means something to you, staying subscribed helps keep these stories alive. The woodpile behind Margaret Coyle's cabin had once reached her shoulder. By the middle of December, it barely reached her knee. She counted the pieces the way some people count coins, quietly, methodically, as if counting more carefully might somehow make the number larger. It never did. 14 split logs. A dozen smaller pieces that would burn fast and give little back. Enough, if she was careful, for perhaps 10 days. Not enough for a Montana winter that had, by every account, only just begun. Her husband, Daniel, had cut that wood in September, before the fever took him in October. He had always cut more than they needed, out of habit, out of a kind of quiet insurance against bad years. This year, there had been no one to repeat that habit. Margaret had done what she could alone, with an axe that felt heavier in her hands every week. But a woman working alone, in the short daylight of early winter, could not match what two people had done together. She did not cry over the woodpile. She had done her crying in October, in private, in the hours after the burial when the house was too quiet to hold any other sound. What she felt now was different. Colder, more practical. It was the particular fear of a person doing arithmetic she could not make come out right. 10 days of wood, 4 months of winter left, at least. She thought about asking for help. The thought did not last long. She had already seen how the valley looked at her. The widow alone on the north section. The one people mentioned in a certain tone of voice at church. The one Elias Whitfield had already suggested, more than once, should sell the land and move into town before the weather made the decision for her. Margaret had told him she would think about it. She had no intention of thinking about it. What she intended, instead, was to walk further than she usually walked, into the rockier ground past the property line, where deadwood sometimes collected among the stones, and nobody bothered to gather it because the ground there was considered worthless, uneven, and not worth the effort. She pulled on her second coat, the one with the frayed cuff she had never gotten around to mending, and took the axe down from its hook. By the time she stepped outside, The sky had the flat gray color that, in that country, usually meant snow before dark. She did not know yet that the walk would take her somewhere she had never truly looked before. The rocky section past the property line did not belong to anyone in any way that mattered. It had been surveyed once, decades earlier, and abandoned by whoever held the claim, left to grow over with scrub brush and loose stone until even the county stopped bothering to mention it. Locals called it the Hollow, though nothing about it was especially hollow. It was simply uneven, cut through with small ravines, difficult to farm, difficult to graze, and difficult to walk without twisting an ankle on ground that looked solid and was not. Children were told to stay out of it, less because it was dangerous and more because it was inconvenient, the kind of place that swallowed an afternoon and gave nothing back. Margaret had passed its edge many times without entering. Today she had no choice. The trees closer to her own land had already been picked clean of anything dry enough to burn well. What remained near the house was either too green to catch or too rotten to hold heat. The hollow, by contrast, was full of old deadfall, fallen branches, and the bones of trees that had died standing years before anyone thought to clear them. She worked methodically, the way she did most things, gathering what she could carry and bundling it with rope she had looped over one shoulder. The cold made her fingers clumsy inside her gloves, and more than once she had to stop and press her hands together simply to feel them again. It was slow work. Twice she heard something move through the brush nearby, likely a deer, though she did not look up long enough to be certain. The light was already beginning to lean toward late afternoon, the kind of light that made every shadow look longer than it should. She was reaching for a fallen branch, half buried in old snow, when she noticed the ground beneath it did not slope the way the rest of the hillside sloped. It was a small thing, the kind of detail a person exhausted from carrying wood might easily have ignored. Margaret did not ignore it. She set the branch down and looked again at the hill in front of her. Really looked, the way she had not allowed herself to look at anything since October. There was a line in the hillside that did not belong to the hillside, a straight edge, faint beneath the frost, where nature had clearly not been the only hand at work. She approached slowly, the rope of firewood still over her shoulder, forgotten for the moment. What had looked, from a distance, like a shadow cast by an overhanging rock turned out, on closer inspection, to be something else entirely. A gap, narrow, low, half concealed by a tangle of dead brush that had grown across it over what must have been many years, but a gap nonetheless, cut into the hillside at an angle that no landslide or erosion could easily explain. Margaret had grown up on a farm. She knew the difference between what weather made and what hands made. This was the second kind. She set down her bundle of wood, an act that felt almost reckless given how much effort it had taken to gather, and crouched near the opening. The brush had been dead long enough to snap easily when she pulled it aside, brittle and gray, and beneath it she found stone. Not scattered stone, the kind any hillside might produce naturally, but stone that had been stacked, deliberately, forming a low wall on either side of the gap like the beginning of a doorway that time had tried, and mostly failed, to erase. Her first instinct was caution. An old mine shaft, perhaps, or a den for something with teeth. The valley had stories about both. But mine shafts did not have walls built with any evident care for how the stones fit together, and no animal she knew of built entrances with anything resembling right angles. She stood there for a long moment, the cold working its way through her second coat, weighing the practical risk of stepping into an unknown space against the growing, uncomfortable curiosity that had settled somewhere beneath her ribs. In the end, it was not bravery that decided it. It was arithmetic. 10 days of firewood, 4 months of winter. And whatever was on the other side of that gap could not possibly make her situation worse than it already was. She ducked her head, turned sideways, and stepped through. Inside, the air was still, in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though the hillside itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to finally open the door. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, what she saw was not the shallow den she had expected, nor the collapsed remains of some failed mining attempt. It was a room. Small, low-ceilinged, no more than 10 feet across, but unmistakably a room, cut partly into the hillside and partly built up with the same stacked stone she had seen at the entrance. Along one wall stood the remains of a hearth, blackened with old soot, with a crude chimney channel rising up through the stone and, she assumed, out somewhere above the hillside, where she had never thought to look for smoke. Scattered across the dirt floor were the quiet debris of someone else's life. A rusted iron pot, cracked through one side. The remains of a wooden shelf, collapsed but still holding the shape of what it had once been. A knife blade, entirely without its handle, the metal pitted with age. No bones, no sign of tragedy, at least none she could read. Only the particular emptiness of a place that had simply been left, deliberately, by someone who never came back for their belongings. She crouched near the hearth, running her fingers along the stone, and noticed something odd. The stone here was warmer than the stone near the entrance. Not by much, barely enough to notice, but enough that her cold fingers registered the difference without her mind fully understanding why. She did not have an answer for that yet. She only knew, standing in a stranger's abandoned room with her rope of firewood forgotten outside, that whoever had built this had known something about this hillside that no one in the valley currently remembered. The question was not whether she could use the shelter. The question was why a builder patient enough to stack these stones by hand had eventually walked away from all of it and never come back. That question would follow her home, and it would still be unanswered 3 days later, when Elias Whitfield knocked on her door to tell her, in no uncertain terms, that she needed to stay away from the hollow entirely. Elias Whitfield was not a cruel man, and Margaret had never thought of him as one, even when his honesty landed harder than she would have liked. He had run cattle on the section east of hers for close to 20 years, had known Daniel since they were both boys, and had said more than once, in the weeks after the funeral, that he would help her however she needed. She believed he meant it, which was part of why his reaction, when she mentioned the shelter, surprised her. He stood in her doorway with his hat still on, which was unlike him, and did not step inside when she offered. "You went into the hollow," he said. It was not a question. She told him what she had found. The stacked stone, the hearth, the warmth in the wall that she still could not explain. She expected curiosity, or at least the mild interest of a neighbor hearing an unusual story. Instead, his face went carefully still, the way a man's face goes still when he is choosing his next words with more care than usual. "That ground's no good, Margaret," he said. "Never has been. My father wouldn't run stock through there, not even in a dry year. Something about the drainage. Ground shifts strange after a hard freeze, more than it ought to." She asked him, reasonably, whether he knew who had built the shelter. He did not answer directly. He said only that there had been someone, before his father's time, who had tried to make a go of that section, and that it had not ended well, though he was vague on the particulars in a way that suggested either he genuinely did not know or did not want to say. "Point is," he said, "nobody's lived on that ground in longer than anyone remembers. That's not an accident. Ground like that, there's usually a reason folks left it be." Margaret considered this. She did not doubt that Elias believed what he was telling her, but she also noticed, standing there in her doorway with the cold coming in around him, that his warning rested more on reputation and old caution than on anything he could actually point to. I have 10 days of firewood, she said quietly, and a chimney that already stands. I'm not asking you to approve of it, Elias. I'm asking you not to stand in the doorway telling me what my father-in-law's cattle wouldn't do 40 years ago. He left without arguing further, though the set of his shoulders as he walked back toward the road told her the conversation was not, in his mind, finished. Margaret closed the door and looked towards the window, toward the direction of the hollow, and made a decision she had, in truth, already made before he ever knocked. What Margaret decided to do over the following days was not something she announced to anyone. She simply began doing it. She returned to the shelter with a shovel, a bundle of rags, and whatever spare tools she could find in Daniel's old shed, and set about making the space usable again. It was slower work than she expected. The old hearth needed clearing of years of settled debris. The stone walls, sound as they looked, had gaps in the mortar wide enough to slip a finger through in places, gaps that would let the cold reach in exactly the way she was trying to keep it out. She did not tell herself she was moving in. That felt, even privately, like too large a thing to admit. She told herself only that a second source of shelter, however strange, was worth more to a woman with 10 days of firewood than an empty principle about staying in the house her husband had built. It was, by any account in that valley, an unusual choice. A widow abandoning even part of her own home to take shelter in a stranger's ruin, on ground the neighbors considered unlucky, built by hands no one could name. Margaret understood how it looked. She had grown up watching how quickly a valley decided what kind of woman someone was, and she knew this would not help her case. She did it anyway. Word reached her, second-hand, through a neighbor's daughter who mentioned it at church without any particular unkindness, that people were calling it the widow's folly. She did not correct the phrase. She had heard worse said about her since October, most of it behind closed doors rather than to her face, and this, at least, was said plainly enough that she could choose to ignore it plainly in return. What mattered more to her, in those first days, was the hearth. She built a small fire in it on the third afternoon, mostly to test whether the old chimney channel still drew air the way it appeared to. For a few minutes, it seemed to work. Smoke rose, thin and gray, up through the stone. Then the wind shifted, and the smoke came back down into the room, thick enough to make her eyes sting and her chest tighten before she managed to smother the flame and stumble back out into the cold coughing, her plan for the evening in sudden and immediate doubt. Margaret sat outside the entrance for a long while after that, wrapped in her coat, waiting for her eyes to stop watering and her breathing to steady. It was not the failure itself that unsettled her so much as what it implied. If the hearth did not draw properly, the shelter was not simply imperfect. It was, in its present condition, unusable and possibly dangerous, in exactly the way Elias had warned her it might be. She forced herself to go back in once the smoke had cleared, and to look at the problem the way Daniel would have looked at it, without emotion, simply as a puzzle with a cause somewhere waiting to be found. The chimney channel itself seemed sound. Stone straight through, no obvious blockage that she could find by reaching a hand up as far as she dared. The hearth itself was clean. The wood she had used was dry enough. It was the wind, she suspected, though she could not yet say why. The smoke had only reversed after several minutes, not immediately, which suggested the problem was not constant but conditional, tied to something about the way the air moved outside, rather than anything wrong with the fire itself. She spent the following 2 days in a state of quiet, frustrated observation, lighting small test fires only long enough to watch what happened before smothering them again, unwilling to fill the small room with smoke a second time. Twice the fire drew cleanly. Once it reversed again, more mildly, just enough to make her cough before she caught it. She began to notice, without yet understanding why it mattered, that the fires which drew badly seemed to happen on afternoons when the wind was coming from a particular direction, down off the higher ground to the north, rather than along the valley floor the way it usually did. It was not proof of anything. It was only a pattern, faint and unconfirmed, the kind of detail a tired and increasingly discouraged woman might easily have dismissed as coincidence. Margaret did not dismiss it. She had spent enough years married to a careful man to know that patterns, however small, were usually trying to tell you something if you were patient enough to keep watching instead of giving up after the second failure. She was still watching 4 days later, when her nephew Caleb came to stay with her while his father recovered from a fall, and pressed his small palm flat against the hearth wall on a morning when no fire had been lit in almost 2 days. Caleb was 8 years old, quiet in the particular way that children become quiet when the adults around them are worried about things they do not fully explain. And he had been sent to stay with Margaret for a week, while his father, her late husband's younger brother, mended a broken ankle 2 farms over. He did not ask many questions about the shelter. He simply followed her there on the second morning, more out of boredom than curiosity, and wandered the small room while she worked at clearing debris from a corner she had not yet reached. It was Caleb who noticed, before she did, that one section of the hearth wall felt different from the rest. "This part's warm," he said, without any particular emphasis, the way children announce facts that seem obvious to them and mildly interesting to no one else. Margaret looked up. No fire had been lit in that hearth for nearly 2 full days, the ashes long since gone cold. She crossed the room and pressed her own hand against the same section of wall. It was not hot. It was barely warmer than the surrounding stone, a difference so slight she might have missed it entirely if her attention had not already been trained, by days of careful watching, to notice exactly this kind of small and inconvenient detail. She asked Caleb to show her exactly where, and he did, patting the stone with the confident indifference of a child who does not yet understand that he has stumbled onto something his aunt has been failing to find for the better part of a week. Margaret stood there a long moment, her hand still against the stone, turning the observation over in her mind. The wall was retaining warmth from a fire 2 days gone. Not from magic, and not from any special property in the stone itself, but from something about how it had been positioned, angled, perhaps, to catch and hold the sun through some part of the day she had not yet paid close enough attention to. If the wall could hold heat that long without a fire, then whoever built this room had understood the sun, the wind, and the stone all together as a single arrangement, rather than as 3 separate problems to be solved, one at a time. She looked towards the entrance, toward the direction the smoke had reversed from 4 days earlier, and felt, for the first time since she had ducked through that gap in the hillside, that she was no longer just clearing rubble. She was reading a message left by someone who had known exactly what they were doing, and had simply never had the chance, or perhaps the reason, to explain it to anyone else. Margaret began paying attention in a different way after that morning with Caleb. Not to the stone alone, but to everything around it. She spent an unusual amount of time simply standing outside the entrance at different hours, watching where the shadow of the ridge fell across the hillside as the sun moved, noting which direction the wind came from in the early morning compared to late afternoon. What she found, over the course of several days, was a pattern that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. The gap in the hillside faced southeast, angled just enough that it caught direct sun for several hours each afternoon without being fully exposed to it, the surrounding rock shielding it from the harsh western light that baked the open ground nearby. That same rock, she realized, sat at an angle that channeled the prevailing wind, the wind that came down hard and cold off the higher ground to the north, around and past the entrance, rather than directly into it. The wind only came in wrong, only pushed smoke back down the chimney channel on the rarer afternoons when it shifted out of the north, instead of its usual path along the valley floor. It was not a flaw in the shelter. It was a known and predictable exception, one that whoever built the hearth had likely understood and simply worked around, timing their fires accordingly rather than fighting the wind directly. The warmth in the wall, she now believed, came from the same careful positioning. The stone did not create heat. It simply held on to whatever heat reached it, from the sun during the day and from the hearth during the evening, releasing it slowly back into the room long after both had gone quiet. It was not a miracle of construction. It was patience, built into stone, by someone who had clearly spent more than one season learning exactly how this hillside behaved before ever laying the first rock. Margaret adjusted her own habits accordingly. She began lighting her fires earlier in the afternoon, while the sun was still angled favorably, and let the stone do a portion of the work overnight that the fire alone had been doing before. She learned to read the sky before lighting anything at all, watching for the particular gray clouds that meant a north wind was coming, and waiting it out when necessary, rather than filling the room with smoke. The shelter was no longer a mystery to her. It had become, slowly, something closer to a conversation, one she was only now learning to hold up her side of. She did not yet know how soon that conversation would be tested. The first real test came 10 days later, in the form of a storm that was not, by any measure, the worst the valley had seen. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, dropped perhaps 8 inches of snow overnight, and cleared by the following morning, the kind of weather that long-time residents barely remarked on, beyond noting that it was, at least, an early sign of the season to come. For Margaret, it was the first real chance to see whether what she had learned about the shelter would hold up under actual pressure, rather than careful daytime observation. She spent that night in the hillside room, having moved a portion of her remaining supplies there over the preceding week, a decision that had drawn a fresh round of quiet disapproval from anyone in the valley who heard about it. She built her fire in the early afternoon, as she had learned to, and settled in as the wind outside began to pick up with the first hints of the coming snow. For most of the night, it held. The wall retained enough warmth that she did not need to feed the fire as often as she would have in her own cabin, and the smoke, for the better part of the storm, drew properly up through the chimney channel and out into the weather. It was not perfect. Sometime after midnight, as the wind briefly shifted direction, she woke to the faint, acrid smell of smoke beginning to settle rather than rise, and had to bank the fire low and wait, coughing quietly into her sleeve, until the wind swung back to its usual path, perhaps 20 minutes later. It was a small failure, and a brief one, but it told her something important all the same. Her understanding of the shelter was correct in its broad strokes, but incomplete in its details. She still did not know how long a true northern wind might last, should one ever settle in for more than 20 minutes, or what would happen to the room if it did not swing back at all. She woke the next morning to 8 inches of undisturbed snow outside the entrance, her small fire still holding a stubborn bed of coals, and the wall beside her sleeping mat still faintly warm to the touch. It had worked, mostly. She did not yet know that the valley's weather that season had one more storm in reserve, considerably larger than the one she had just survived, and that it was already beginning to gather itself somewhere over the mountains to the north. The storm that arrived 11 days later gave almost no warning worth trusting. The morning began clear and unusually still, the kind of stillness that older residents of the valley had learned, over the years, to regard with suspicion rather than relief. By early afternoon, the sky had taken on a strange yellow-gray cast, and by the time Margaret noticed the wind had died entirely, Elias Whitfield was already riding hard toward her property, having seen the same signs from his own porch, and having no intention of letting her face what was coming without at least offering, one more time, to bring her into town. She met him at the edge of her land. He did not dismount. "This one's different, Margaret," he said, and for once she did not hear caution in his voice so much as genuine alarm. "You need to come into town. Now, not after." She looked past him, toward the direction of the hollow, and then back at her own cabin, its woodpile now reduced to almost nothing, its walls thin against whatever was coming. She made her decision quickly, though it did not feel quick from the inside. She thanked him, told him she would be safe, and asked him only to check on her in 2 days if the roads allowed it. He did not look satisfied with the answer, but he did not argue further either, perhaps recognizing, for the first time, that the widow's folly had become something closer to a considered choice. The blizzard broke within the hour, arriving not gradually but all at once, wind and snow together, the kind of storm that erased the line between the sky and the ground entirely. Margaret reached the shelter with her supplies just ahead of the worst of it, and built her fire earlier than usual, sensing correctly that there would be no gentle afternoon light to help her today. For the first several hours, the shelter performed exactly as she had come to expect. Then, sometime after dark, the wind began doing something she had not seen it do before, not settling into its usual northern pattern, but shifting unpredictably from one direction to another, as if the storm itself could not decide which way to push. The smoke began to reverse, then clear, then reverse again, worse than before. Caleb, who had been staying with her again while his father's ankle continued healing, began to cough, quietly at first, then with an insistence that made Margaret's chest tighten with something far sharper than smoke. She had a decision to make, and very little time in which to make it. Margaret did not panic, though she would later admit to no one but herself how close she had come to it. She remembered, in that moment, not a rule but an image, the way the stone near the hearth had always warmed slowest and held longest, the way the wind, however it turned outside, had never fully broken the room's warmth, even on the night it had briefly filled with smoke. She smothered the fire rather than fighting to keep it burning through the unpredictable wind, trusting the stored warmth in the stone to carry them through the worst hours rather than risking more smoke than a coughing child could safely breathe. She wrapped Caleb close against the warm wall, the one he himself had first pointed out to her weeks earlier, and waited. The wind screamed outside for most of the night, shifting, doubling back, doing everything Elias had once warned her that ground was capable of. The room did not fill with smoke again. It did not need to. What Margaret had built, without ever fully intending to, was not a shelter that fought the storm directly, but one that had already banked enough patience into its walls to survive several hours without needing to fight anything at all. By morning, the wind had settled into an ordinary, exhausted quiet, and the snow outside had reached nearly to the top of the entrance. Elias found them 2 days later, once the roads allowed it, having ridden out expecting, by his own later admission, to find considerably worse. He said very little when Margaret opened the door to greet him, Caleb standing beside her, tired but entirely well. He looked past her, into the small room with its blackened hearth and its stacked stone walls for a long moment before speaking. No one in the valley mentioned the phrase widow's folly again after that winter. Not to her face, and as far as she ever heard, not behind her back either. The shelter did not make Margaret Coyle wealthy. It did not undo the loss of the previous October, and it did not change how difficult the remaining months of that winter would be. What it gave her in the end was something she had not realized she was missing until she felt it return. Not luck, not rescue, Simply the quiet, steady proof that she had been right to trust her own patience over everyone else's caution. In the years that followed, according to later recollections passed down through the valley, 2 other families facing hard winters made use of that same hillside room, always with Margaret's blessing, always leaving it a little better than they found it, the way she had. The wall had never been about the stone. It had been about learning, slowly and without shortcuts, exactly what the wind had been trying to say all along. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.